I've come back to the Castle Museum. Patronage of the arts in Weimar continued throughout the 19th century. Karl Alexander August Johann, Grand Duke of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach, son of Grand Duke Karl Frederick and Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, sustained the tradition of Weimar's classical period over a period of almost half a century until his death in 1901. It was he who commissioned the Reichel monument of Goethe and Schiller for the Theaterplatz and founded the Weimar School of Art in 1860. It's the artwork that came out of the latter that I want to consider in this episode, and there are several outstanding examples in the Weimar castle. Having looked at the work of Haeckel and Frege, I want to consider how naturalism in art is not the same thing as naturalism in the sciences. I want to consider in this episode how the dwindling status of the Weimar Identity Thesis and the ongoing redefinition of naturalism by the end of the 19th century affected the themes addressed by Weimar artists. This is Christian Rolf's Schneidermühle an der Ilm in Eriksdorf, his sawmill on the River Ilm. I'm biased in favour of this particular work because the location is only 5 minutes walk from the international school, and I visit this spot quite frequently, although the sawmill is no longer a sawmill. Rolfs studied at the Weimar School of Arts from 1870 and continued to live in the city for more than 30 years, depicting many local sites in his work. He and others of the Weimar School were committed to the ideal of modernity, but not by way of representing the new urban and industrial landscapes that were emerging at this time, and he was not at all interested in the growing influence of scientific positivism. Positivism, or naturalism, which is the equivalent today, posits that the universe and everything in it is a single integrated entity governed by consistent laws and forces that, if technology allowed, could be identified empirically. The underlying structure and operation of the universe will be shown to be a consequence of these laws and nothing else. Ghosts and spirits and celestial deities may be a part of a fertile human imagination, but they don't exist in reality. Naturalism specifically rejects Cartesian dualism, the notion that there are two substances in the cosmos, nature on the one hand and mind on the other. It refutes the notion of any kind of mental or supernatural or mystical realms that might exist outside of this single entity and its laws and forces. If Rolf's interest in nature is a refutation of the importance of naturalism, then that doesn't mean there are ghosts here. Indeed, there are no melodramatic spectacles at all in his work. Even when there's a weir, the landscape is calm and unassuming. It's the experience of the scene and the relationship between the self and the natural world that preoccupies the artist. In this case, the landscape is divided into two sections flowing from top to bottom, literally with the flow of the water. Above the weir, the surface of the mill pond is flat. It's calm, but then the river gushes down the mill dam into the lower section, creating all kinds of swirling eddies and currents. The river continues on, but still the water is turbulent. The surface is now a cauldron of splashing waves with the cloudy sky adding a grey tone to its choppiness. But as I said, it's not the material reality of the waves and the clouds that are important here. It's a human experience of these things. Many people in Grand Duke Karl Alexander's era, and also in today's era, have equated naturalism not only with natural laws, but also with determinism. I should use the term deterministic naturalism to emphasize this. The implications are, the world is a physical machine that operates completely independently of what people presume to be human agency. There is no free will. Life and existence in general has no meaning, at least in objective terms, beyond the mechanical operations of chemistry and physics and the evolutionary tides of biology. This deterministic interpretation of science and technology, and the development of urban landscapes to support the technology, was bound to cause a reaction among those such as Rolfs, committed to values of autonomous expression. Romantic artists were made to feel just as alienated as their Enlightenment predecessors. But actually, even today, it cannot be definitively demonstrated that naturalism implies determinism. Modern empirical knowledge describes phenomena such as mass and energy, particles and waves, but actually none of these necessarily imply anything deterministic at all. Science hasn't been able to adequately describe what the laws of gravitation and electromagnetism and thermodynamics actually are. Indeed, many physics concepts such as quantum wave fields and the conservation of energy are completely paradoxical and far more mystical than any mystical spirituality. I'll return to this later. However, naturalism does imply a metaphysical realism, at least according to most naturalists. As I've said before, it asserts a mind-independent world and the subservience of the mind to that world. It rejects idealism and the notion that the world is mind-dependent. This means that in addition to rejecting supernaturalism, it also goes out of its way to reject the Weimar Identity Thesis, the ontological premise that mind and nature are analogous entities equally dependent upon one another. Given that the rejection of supernaturalism had been proceeding relentlessly for centuries, to the extent that by the late 19th century it was only folk culture and common sense psychology and faith-based revealed knowledge that remained, or so Nietzsche would have said, then it can be said that the Weimar Identity Thesis, as expressed by Rolfs and other Weimar School artists, alongside the works of Nietzsche, were the only remaining objections to naturalism. It might have been said that the legitimacy of almost every natural science in the world depended upon refuting the Weimar Identity Thesis. In a recent survey of views pertaining to the external world, conducted as a part of a wide-ranging study by Bourget and Chalmers among contemporary professional philosophers mostly working in the English-speaking analytical tradition, 82% of respondents responded in favour of realism. A pitiful 4% were in favour of idealism, oh dear, and another 5% were in favour of maintaining a sceptical, non-aligned position. 82% is a large majority, given the ground used to justify realism is shaky. I've already looked at how epistemic justifications have embraced anti-realism, but I haven't got to my favourite yet, Hilary Putnam's twin Earth hypothesis. Putnam's thought experiment in his paper The Meaning of Meaning asks us to imagine that there are two planets at different ends of the galaxy or the universe that are identical in every respect except one. On one planet, the water is comprised of the molecular structure H2O, and on the other it's composed of XYZ, representing some other particular structure. Otherwise, everything else is exactly the same. There are even folks out there watching the Iphigenia Inquiry. But actually not, because the thought experiment is set 200 years ago in the time of classical Weimar, and both planets are populated by people that haven't developed much in the way of technology yet. They don't even know that the water on their planet is H2O or XYZ respectively. And actually, the water seems the same on both planets. There's nothing to tell them apart. And here's the point. When they conceive water in their minds, the conceptions are the same, but the referent is different, which in turn implies there's no justification for ever assuming a correlation between concept and reality. Of course, scientific progress on our planet has discovered that water is comprised of oxygen and hydrogen atoms, comprised of 8 and 1 electrons respectively, which are elementary particles with no substructure. But that doesn't imply anything as regards the relationship between a mind conceiving H2O and H2O itself. Unless shared knowledge is able to encompass everything about every particle and every natural law influencing that particulate, then there will always be epistemological limits to knowledge. As regards determinism, there are theorists today who look back to the characterization made by Laplace back in 1820 and argue that, even if it can't be proved, determinism is still the best fit theory for evidence currently available. But there are also others, like Quine, who I discussed earlier, who disagree and point out it's impossible by definition, by way of ontological commitment, to empirically demonstrate either determinism or any kind of realism in general. People will never know the truth of free will. The obvious response for a painter is to paint. And perhaps the obvious response for the rest of us is to join the 5%ers and become sceptical about the entire matter. Sceptical about naturalism, sceptical about reality, and sceptical about the reality of anything pertaining to our own minds. Fortunately, there's a recourse of music, and it seems there's a wind band playing Rolf's contemporary, Johann Strauss, in the Schlosshof. Well, I'm no art critic, but I'm told Rolfs introduced an innovative approach to the use of the paintbrush, scratching and creating original forms of brushwork. He also used a palette knife. He didn't want the conventional smooth and shiny varnished surface. But actually, I don't see this when I look at this painting. Neither do I see the focus on the natural, the desire to feel at home in nature, the desire to be a part of nature. What I see is a fearfulness of modernism, of urbanization, of alienation, a rejection of naturalism and all it represents.
I see a lack of any alternative too. This is no Nietzschean meta-tragedy. There's a strong focus on the aesthetic, but there's no attention to the metaphysical at all. In fact, I sense a rigid adherence to neutrality, in other words, to scepticism, which is portrayed in reverting to utopian landscapes. It's a beautiful piece, but the artist is compromised. He's stuck with saying, let's enjoy beauty and, at most, maintain a healthy degree of disdain for any of these modern illusions pertaining to the so-called deterministic real world.
Here's another remarkable representation of the countryside. This is Albert Brendel's Schaffmarkt by Weimar, the sheep market, painted in 1880. Brendel has a reputation for capturing the atmospherics in his natural landscapes, whatever the weather conditions and whatever the time of day. Here it's as if we can see the natural movement of the animals. They have more personality than the people in the background. In fact, I'm told Brendel was an acknowledged expert at painting animals, and he emphasised his focus during his years teaching and as director at the Weimar School of Art.
Again, confronted by the mechanistic determinism of positivism, there's a strong emphasis placed on the imagination and dreams, and on spiritualism and mysticism. This is a late Romantic spirit, the renunciation of the modern and its inhumane implications, the reliance upon Weimar identity as shelter and refuge. There's a delving into psychological states by way of poignant tales and legends. There's not the desire to depict things as they are, or as they might be, but in terms of the experience of things and the effect they produce. However, to my eyes, the consequences are themselves compromised. Given hindsight and given the nature of my inquiry, the strongest aesthetic feature I experience being expressed is a sad scepticism. In rejecting objectivism outright and wallowing in subjectivism, there's a resignation that it might not be possible to be sure of anything. It might not be possible for any of us as minds even to be sure of other minds, the people we see around us, to be sure if anyone is really communicating with anyone else, and to dispel the possibility that the communities of people we see around us are essentially illusion. In its most extreme sense, this position points to solipsism. Scepticism and solipsism were not created out of nothing by late 19th century artists. Both stances have a long history, reaching as far back as discussions about the nature of universals. There have been many who have opposed its basic thesis, arguing that if scepticism justifies itself merely by way of the inability of other arguments to fully justify themselves, then it's not a real argument at all. It's merely a form of defeatism. But many others have embraced the approach. The work of Pyrrho of Elis, dating back to the Hellenistic period of ancient Greece, did not consider scepticism to be the recourse of the disillusioned. Pyrrhonian scepticism perceives itself as a component of open-mindedness, and more akin to the spirit of inquiry I'm trying to bring to these episodes. In contrast, the scepticism of 18th century David Hume was all-encompassing. The fact that I am the same person today that I was yesterday cannot be proved by experience or rationalization, by a posteriori or a priori justification. No scientific theory based on recourse to natural law can ever be proved beyond doubt. The best science can do is to describe what it sees and nothing more. It was a position that offered some consolation to late Romantic artists.
This is Ludwig von Hoffman's Tanzend, his Dancers, completed in 1906. It's a very different type of landscape compared to those of Rolfs or Brendel.
Hoffman was appointed to work in the Grand Ducal School of Art in 1903, which was the era of symbolism, and in particular of Art Nouveau. And so now we're in Arcadia, with its colourful flowers and plants and glowing vibrancy, and with its yellow and orange hills and the deep blue sky. At the side, surrounded by vertical orange trees, there's a group of young dancers set in the bright sunlight. They've abandoned themselves to the rhythm of the music, carefree, entranced by the wind and the waves, with their veils and robes swirling around them. The girls are goddesses. It's a jubilant scene, happy-go-lucky, yet also ecstatic. It's a utopian dream, an idyllic vision where body and nature are united as one. Furthermore, the link to ancient Greece, in the flowing robes, in the idealized bodies, and in the privileging of the aesthetic above all else, the sense of harmony with the natural environment is tangible. I've taken a moment to come to the German National Theatre, the DNT. This is the gallery foyer, which is adorned with further examples of Hoffman's euphoric dream worlds, painted in 1907 in what was at that time the Weimar Court Theatre.
Hoffman became one of the pioneers of the new Weimar modernist movement, encouraged by Grand Duke Wilhelm Ernst in response to the suppressive and constricting cultural politics of Berlin. These works anticipate the emancipated and enfranchised spirit of the Weimar Republic, rapturous in its own liberation and sovereignty. If skepticism is grounded by the inability of human subjectivity to justify any kind of knowledge, from metaphysical reality to aesthetic judgments, still skeptics have found two broad types of characterizations to justify their position. The Hoffman reveals one of these, the dream scenario. An individual may feel from a subjective perspective they're in a perfectly normal state of mind, but actually it's perfectly feasible to consider they may be dreaming or in some hallucinatory state without realizing it. In that case, everything that's seen and heard and experienced in the world is a part of the dream. It's all illusion, or it might be. It's not possible to prove one way or the other whether the individual, the self, is in a dream state. Consequently, the individual cannot be sure of anything. Skepticism is the only tenable position. There's no truth of the matter about anything. An objection to this scenario might ask how this position is any different to the fallibilism that was the reason for the skepticism in the first place. Fallibilism respects that the individual's perceptions are not accurate, that they're illusion, to some degree at least. Indeed, empirical investigation confirms the assumptions that what we see is not what's actually there. The individual doesn't see the lattice of molecules that comprises a canvas. What he sees is only the light reflecting off the image, not even the image itself. However, compared to dream skepticism, fallibilism is far less severe. It allows for some level of confidence in truth. Fallibilism encompasses a skeptic's dream state as an extreme version of itself, and not a contradictory or refuting position. The second characterization made by skeptics to justify the position is that humanity might be under duress from a hidden external agent, which in turn might have reason to purposefully keep individuals away from the truth of the matter pertaining to reality. Either, according to Descartes, there's an evil demon tricking people into thinking things are not actually true, or, according to Hilary Putnam's similar anti-realist position, it's some mad scientist who's managed to prevent people realizing they're actually a brain in a vat. Or, according to the Wachowski brothers, it's machines who've plugged people into the Matrix. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. You are a slave born into bondage in a prison that you cannot see or smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind.
Whatever the details of the story, the underlying premise is that the individual is purposely deceived. The mind functions perfectly normally, but the sense perception of the external world is merely a neural simulation. An objection to these kinds of scenarios might point out the similarity with conspiracy theory syndrome, which is a form of neuroticism and probably needs to be referred to psychological therapy. Virtue epistemology, which I've spoken in favour of before, would argue that suggestions of purposeful duress lack integrity and credibility. Indeed, in my role at the international school, all the time I see young people continually developing increased integrity by way of greater levels of independence. The path to autonomy is sometimes a difficult one, and even more so depending on cultural background, and the residue of overcoming parental and community authority lingers in the psyche. Psychology would explain the phenomena better, but it's clear that the alien argument is another form of false authority fallacy. Not that Descartes would have agreed with that conclusion. As I said, he used the evil demon to assert that no one can know anything of the world for certain, including matters pertaining to psychology. He pointed out that for any contingent proposition about the world, it's possible to posit a sceptical hypothesis such that we can only know the proposition if we know the sceptical hypothesis is not true. Given it's not possible to know the sceptical hypothesis is false, it's impossible to know anything about the world. But here's the punchline. Descartes went on to solve the problem by appeal to God, who, he argued, would not allow for an evil demon, or for people to be tricked by illusion. Consequently, we know truth by way of God's grace. It's not an argument that can be demonstrated empirically, but Descartes looked for certainty in terms of indubitability, or immunity to doubt. He believed God would not deceive, and this gave indubitability. But according to Nietzsche, perhaps the greatest skeptic of all, God was dead. The turn of the century, above all else, was a time of contradiction and uncertainty, and the Weimar Identity Thesis itself was left with little meaning and efficacy. I'll finish with another section from the piece I played at the beginning of this episode. This is Matsuri, for 8 instruments, featuring members of the Hiroshima Symphony Orchestra. Thanks for listening.